And today we're going to be talking first about roadshows. So by this, we just mean when you have to travel for your game. So in the LEC a couple of weeks ago, well, not everyone, but a bunch of teams went to Madrid and they actually called it a roadshow, hence why we're stealing that word. But it can apply to anything else. It can apply to an event. It can apply to a competition. For example, if you're a fan of CS2, you've watched at least two teams, Falcons and Vitality, play in the finals in Melbourne, and then a week later playing the finals in Europe for Blast. So traveling literally the entire world in a week. So how would you even begin to think about approaching this as a coach, Watson? How do you approach a roadshow?
Hi, John. Yeah, so this was a challenging one to prepare for because, as you might expect, scientific research using that term roadshow brings back a whole range of different topics. So I went down the route of preparing for sort of tournament competition that is more than likely going to be in person. And I tried to find papers and work around that kind of topic. And unfortunately, not a lot done in esports, which we, probably unsurprised by that. Quite a lot done in the Olympics. So a lot of what I could garner from sort of people that put a lot of thought into this came from Olympics. And just the complexity of preparing for that type of competition. And I suppose everything I might spit out today has to come with the huge caveat that the Olympic cycle is just so much larger. So for an Olympic cycle, you're looking at the end of one Olympics and then the 4-year gap before the next one. And so that doesn't align very well with preparing a team in esports for competition, because usually those windows of time are much smaller. However, there are some ideas that are maybe worth throwing around. But yeah, so I took a quite bird's eye view of preparing for performance, and that performance being in person and all the ins and outs of that. That was my sort of stance. I don't know whether you agree with that.
I mean, the other thing as well that's worth kind of throwing out there to begin with is that we'll talk about things that I think you can optimize and things that can definitely be done better, especially than a lot of esports teams do currently. But it's probably worth mentioning, at least as far as I'm aware, when we're talking about shorter timeframes, this is not something that can be optimized so that it doesn't matter. Traveling to a new event, you will play worse, almost definitely. I remember at one stage when we were first in the LEC, we were experimenting with this idea of being based in London and traveling out to Berlin for the games. Astralis, for a while, they were based in Copenhagen, I think, and they traveled out for the games. And there's a few other teams who've experimented with that because, of course, the company is British. Everyone was based in London. No one spoke German. There's a bunch of reasons why it would be easier to set things up in London and better for the content, all that kind of thing. And I think I remember talking to Grant, who is now the head of esports at Falcons, about this. And he said they did a study or they looked into how NFL teams approach it, because NFL teams have to do this roadshow thing quite a lot. They have to go and play in the other parts of the country. And of course, US is a big enough country that's the same as traveling all over Europe. And basically, no matter what you do, even with your private jet and your first class tickets and all that kind of thing, you just perform worse. You will always perform at least a bit worse. And it's just about reducing that risk. So is that something that you came across as well when you're researching this? Or is there a way to actually completely play at the same standard?
Yeah, I think risk was it's a spot-on word. That's what came across most in the research. It wasn't that people saw this as an opportunity to sort of... Typically, people didn't see this as an opportunity to break out of normal habits and routines and reach this next level because of this change. It was seen as more the change introduces elements of the unknown. Those are going to be risks to performance, and how do we anticipate and cope with those potential negative factors or hindrances to our optimal and usual performance. So I think there was one framework, and last week we had some real good discussion around a basic framework. One framework I came across was all about preparing to cope with adversity during the games. So it was Olympic athletes in preparation for going to the Olympics, and they were sitting down and thinking about how do we best prepare for this new situation and the likelihood that we're going to encounter things that might be detrimental to our performance. So exactly as you say, people aren't seeing it as a springboard to reach new heights. I would say that there might be a caveat there that actually if it really means something to people, and in esports, if perhaps you've been a remote team for a long period of time, the novelty aspect, the new experience, and the experience to be sort of putting your skills on show more, I think there is probably good research from a psychological perspective to say that could unlock new levels of focus and concentration and motivation. So I could see an argument in esports for it being something different in a positive sense, but
in general, it's just something you're trying to minimize the risk of. Although, to be fair, there's a lot of things in coaching where that is the goal. If you can make this situation have a less negative impact on your team, that's great work. And the other thing as well in esports, there's especially very experienced players. Now, this is maybe a little bit different because we're not really talking about Roadshow. We're talking about playing on stage versus playing online. Sometimes very experienced players are better, at least compared to everyone else, which is an important caveat, on stage. Mm-hmm. So G2, for example, when they had their unbelievably dominant run from 2019 going forward, they first lost during COVID when it was online. And I think you could actually make the case quite easily that they wouldn't have lost if they had been in the arena, because caps versus everyone else when you're on a big stage seems to be a bigger gap than when you were online, which is interesting because you think about how many knock-on effects there have been since that. The whole G2 project got kind of completely taken apart because of these splits where they didn't win. Different topic. I get distracted. So what's this framework then for minimizing the downsides of a Roadshow?
Yes. So the first step, which I thought was really worth spelling out and really thinking about, and probably the most practical step that we can consider, is collect as much information as possible about the location, venue, and tournament itself. And I knew this would resonate with you because we've spoken about this in terms of cycling teams, for example. Just thinking through, what are you entering into? What is the scenario you're entering into? What can we expect in that scenario? What's it going to be like? And so, thinking about the location, they were thinking about, is the venue we're competing in going to be at high altitude or not? What rules are going to be around the tournament that we have to abide by? What will be the contact time between coach and athlete? So all of that level of detail about gather that information, which I thought was great.
Yeah, I'm very, very pro that. That's from a. It's nice when it lines up. That's from a practical perspective, what I would say, and from a looking at other stories of successful sports teams, what I would say. And it's nice sometimes when the research kind of backs up what some people have been doing. And for me, that's just the most crucial part is to get as much information as possible, with the goal, at least in my mind, of being proactive, not reactive with what happens. And this is something which I can speak about a bit more later. I really didn't do in Nottingham for the last time we went to finals, and I was far too reactive. And that's where I, as I've talked about on this show, was very unhappy with my own performance during our last kind of roadshow, because I wasn't going there in advance and saying, okay, how can I take control of this situation as much as possible? It's more just going and seeing what happens. And suddenly there's a pause and it's like it's happening to us. And then in between the games, like we're told we can't go here and that's happening to us. But we could have proactively found a place to go, built a process of what we're going to do. All that kind of stuff I think is really, really important. And if you look, the example, I think it was off stream, so I'm going to say it again. Apologies if I'd used this exact same story last week. The first thing I think of when I looked at this topic was what happened with South African rugby for the last couple of World Cups and how they prepared for those. And they've done loads of press about them because it was an unbelievable story. And also they're just really open, which is fantastic. And so we can see a lot of the details of how they approached going to Japan, for example, coming in as the 8th seed or whatever and winning the event. And it was the core of Razi's approach, their director of rugby. We're going to be the first ones there and the last ones to leave. That was his idea. So obviously the last ones is because we won, but the first ones there is the part that we can actually control. And they were the first ones there by a long way. And they were getting used to the temperatures because they'd really studied Japan before. They'd studied that actually it can be unbelievably hot during that time, especially in where you're playing, depending on where you are in the country. And the example that he used that he's super proud of, and so drops a lot, is that at the beginning of the tournaments, the only teams that were taking the train everywhere were South Africa and Japan. And by the end of the tournament, everyone was taking the train everywhere. Because if you just look at the numbers, you say, okay, right, a flight takes 2 hours and the train takes 3 hours or 4 hours. But if you go through the experience, which is what they did, they literally had someone go months before and just travel around. And he found like the train is just way better. It's just no stress. You get on at the platform. The trains are so comfortable and quiet. And you can get real rest or do real work while you're on the train that you can't do on a flight, no matter how fancy your ticket is. So it's those kind of things that allow you to be very proactive. So yeah, gathering data, going in advance and thinking through all the possible things that could happen in advance. Massive fan of that first one.
Fantastic. That reminds me of, on a much, much lower level, driving to a tournament in Germany as the coach of a team, having to drive the minibus, not factoring in the stress of driving a minibus full of 12 players on the German Autobahn, which was
actually,
yeah, that was stress-inducing. I was not rested when I arrived. The train would have been better. But just to linger on that one, what information do you think? You mentioned that it was possible to collect some info about Nottingham. You've obviously got Copenhagen coming up. What could you collect, and how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first things first, you've got to be there earlier. So not that I regret this, obviously, especially if she's watching. It was my wife's birthday on the Friday, so I even missed the media day. I wasn't even there a day before. But in advance, just the sooner in advance you can go, the better. For example, we're going to do a boot camp before. We're leaving something 3 or 4 days before, depending on if we win next week. It'll either be 3 days before our game if we're playing 2 games, or 4 days before our game if we're only playing in the finals. And I want to make sure that not only are we doing stuff around the boot camp, but that we're going to the venue, we're exploring the venue, literally just where is everything? Where is the nearest toilet? Where is the nearest place we can get water? How is the food situation going to work? And then I want to be proactive around building a specific process that we're going to do in between the games and being clear about it with everybody. So how is the day going to look? What's actually going to happen? When are we going to arrive? When are we going to have to wake up to arrive then? What are we going to do when we get there? Can we sort out passes before the day? Who's going to be the person who's responsible for us? They'll have a player manager, like an overall one, but probably one per team. How do things work? How is the stream set up? Obviously, that's going to be a big one for us. People were messing about with my stream after the first draft of the finals last time, which is a bit of probably not the best situation. And there's always going to be stuff you don't consider, but you just want to think about as much as possible. So I think it's okay to say this. The event in Nottingham was great for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that was a bit of a shock to me was that it was also used a little bit for the students there to take up some roles. And some of the behavior from the people running the event was not what I would expect. So as an example, someone was speaking to me during the draft about something that's completely irrelevant. In game 3, I was tapped on the shoulder by a ref and said after the draft you should go over and shake the hand of the other coach. We've been doing this every game up till that point, but also there's not very many seconds in a draft to think about everything. No. So there will be some things that you can't fully consider, but just having, okay, what's going to happen after every game? What's the day look like? All those kind of things I think are really, really important. And the main thing is just be there early and be around everything and go and do a full dry run if you can. So as a coach, obviously there's other things that I'm thinking, and also I have to obviously take care of myself a lot. But a different example would be that for the job that I do with Falcons, we're going to the Esports World Cup. Never been there. No idea about anything about the venue. No idea about how it will be run. To be honest, at the moment, they're not entirely sure how the event is going to be run. But I want to make sure the event is on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I'm going to get there on Monday. And I just want to get in and see everything as much as possible when I get there. So I've sent them a bunch of questions that I already have. What's the behind the scenes like? All that kind of thing. They haven't really been able to provide that many answers. But as long as I can go and see it, what I really want to do kind of is I'll do a dry run of the whole day.
Mm-hmm.
The players are going to experience. Because that's, as far as I'm concerned, kind of my only focus when I go on a roadshow. Whereas if I'm there as a coach, obviously I'm taking care of my own performance, also thinking about all the other stuff that I will need to be thinking about. So that's kind of some ways to do it. It's literally just thinking through in advance. And that's what I mean by proactive rather than reactive. Before the problems happen, what is a potential problem here and how could we fix it? What is a potential good thing we can do here and how can we get it? So probably in Copenhagen, I want to find a way for us to get outside in between every game. So how do we do that? Do I need to talk to someone about a pass? Do I need to make sure that they know? I'll probably talk to them about it the day before, because sometimes these buildings, you can't just open doors.
Yeah.
So we don't want to set off any alarms in between our games. So as that example, that's one tiny area, but I'll make sure I'm very open about that with them. So that's kind of my approach, but it does just stem from being that, like, this is why I think it's great to phrase it actually in the way that you did with just gathering data, because a lot of what I'm saying there, maybe it sounds complicated, and that's only because I've thought about it before and I've done these events before. But just as a base rule, being there, getting as much data points as you can is already going to set you ahead of everyone else.
Yeah. I could have gone with a much more game term, like maybe recon or yeah, something like that.
True.
But yeah, all of that, like scouting, like data collection, information gathering is super important. And actually, I think something you dropped in there that is really probably a great first step for any coach preparing for an in-person event is to email, like send a message with a list of questions and see if you can get that information. Because yes, you can go early to the event, but if there's like maybe a feature of the event that's going to interrupt a normal game day, it might interrupt a player's routine. And if that's what they learn within a couple of days of it happening, they might not have that much time to adjust their own routine. So if you can get that a week or even earlier via email, you can start to think about, well, if we have to do like an interview, for example, 45 minutes prior to the game, then this is going to be in the middle of maybe you have a rest stage as a player and it's going to be right in the middle of that. So we need to accommodate that, and the earlier the better. So just it sounds so straightforward, but you can imagine detrimental to performance if it's sprung on you. Likewise with not knowing how to get out of the building, like if that's sprung on you in the moment and all you wanted was a breath of fresh air to go through a normal team process, like very detrimental. If it's sprung on you, completely avoidable with preparation. So
yeah, 100%. And the other thing that I would give as a piece of advice is to talk to people who might have gone before. So again, if you take the EWC example, not true with Copenhagen, but there's plenty of people at Falcons who have been to the Esports World Cup before. So my first step was to ask them, how does it normally go? Now, the thing is that they said probably you're going to be in different venues from anything we've done before, but normally there's, this is how it goes. There's this and this behind the stage in terms of food and stuff. And even that kind of thing is useful to just have something that you want to be checking. You can make yourself a full checklist if you want when you go around the day before, but finding a time to recon, I think, is perfect.
Excellent. Yeah. It reminds me of a former colleague of mine, excellent sports psych, reported back to me in conversation about one of his first on-site, I won't name the team, but on-site support for a team competing at an international event. And upon entering the arena and actually having to lose the first match with the team, they realized actually that it was the PC settings weren't quite right. So the hardware they were using weren't at the right settings, and they hadn't like worked that into their like pre-game routine to like check those settings and make sure everything's configured as usual as they have been training with. And it was maybe after the first round that they had to make those adjustments, and that messed with them a little bit, and they ended up losing that first match. And with that experience, that sports psych will always have that ready in future. So asking that person, you gain that knowledge. You don't have to go through that same experience. And yeah, absolutely, like critical aspect of learning here. So
yeah, and for esports, of course, if you do have a time to test the setups, that's perfect. So actually, reminds me, I was going to do it as soon as we qualified, and we qualified last week, and I haven't done it. I'm going to email someone or message some people at NLC and say, is there a way we can do some scrims or solo queue from the stage on Friday or something, or anything like that. So there might not be a chance.
Awesome.
But if you don't ask, you'll never
Yeah.
you'll never get. So rather than necessarily having to arrive hours and hours before to make sure everything's okay, which is what we had to do in Nottingham, we can just do it the day before. Or maybe I'll ask, okay, if we're only in the finals, let's say, after the semi-final, please can we come on and play a few scrims from the stage, and then we can just sort of test out the setups and test out the environment, and just finding any excuse to again gather more data.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm excited. I feel like we're putting across like tangible, practical, usable things here. This is great. So step 2, performers and staff to discuss the information on the list and all the potential adversities the athletes may face. So we've sort of touched on this, but we sort of touched on what's going to happen and what's going to be the shape and structure of things. But actually discussing with your players, once you've got that information, what are the sort of potential hiccups here, and making a fairly exhaustive list of these, and considering if you have a performance model that's made up of different areas, for example, training, physical fitness, nutrition, social life, psychology, all that kind of stuff, strategy, game-specific plans, try and map out the factors that are going to influence it'll be a hiccup in all of those areas, rather than just focusing on, for example, the game-specific stuff. Try and think about what's going to be a hindrance to sleep, to game day routine, to the psychology of it. Are you going to be exposed to a big audience that you weren't ready for? So trying to think about all the things that are going to be an adversity for you and your performance. So discussing with players is an important one to get an idea of what are the bigger factors and what are the lesser factors, and then what are the ones that we can sort of anticipate happening, and what are the emergency situations that are unlikely to happen but are maybe worth preparing for. So that was stage 2.
Yeah, I like that. I like that as well. And it's just it's a very natural next stage to what exactly we were talking about. And I would say you don't even need to do them 1, 2, because if you have 2 already sorted, then you know what data points to get, because you know the kind of questions you need to ask. But I think something that comes in here, which we'll definitely talk about in the next section, is this idea of like this marginal gains kind of thing. So that's the way that I would definitely approach this, which is that there's nothing that could happen on the day that's too small to be considered. Now, you might well think that we're not going to do anything about this certain problem that might happen because it's just going to be a small thing. But you should still consider it, because it could be that you can do something very easily. Maybe just have a 5-minute conversation about it. What do we do if? Maybe that solves your problem. And even though it's got a low chance of happening, or it has a higher chance of happening but a low effect, it still costs you nothing to lay that piece of groundwork in first. So we are certainly going to have some talks about what happens if there's pauses. Because last time there was hours and hours of pauses. We started our game 1 was supposed to start at 10 a.m. UK time. Game 2 started at 1:30, I think, was the way the series went last time, because there was just so many pauses and tech problems. And actually, at the end of the day, throughout the whole of game 1, this maybe relates to our pressure training, the players couldn't really hear each other. And you can tell if you go back, I think Matty's one is the one I've used as an example before, so I'm sure it's there. If there is still the VOD of Matty playing the NLC finals, he literally can barely hear anything. When there's 2 people talking, there's so much like robot-y static that you can't hear them both. If one person's talking at once, you can hear it. It's a bit painful on the ears. But if a couple of people are talking like in a team fight, it's just absolutely crazy. Oof. So what do we do in those situations? Like all those kind of things I think are useful. Although I will say, with that, it is worth being clear with players. You never want them to be in a situation where they feel like everything is prepared and so that's why it's okay. Because there will be stuff that comes up that you haven't prepared for. And so it's like you need to make sure that they're also have just the resilience to, or at least be aware, like, guys, stuff is going to come up. Which I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but it leads me on to one of the things that I think is always a good thing as a coach, is to frame the roadshow. And we spoke about before, everyone's going to play worse. Well, everyone is likely to play worse. And that's a very actually useful piece of framing. I always tell people when whenever we're playing, it's not about being perfect. It's about being better than the other team. And that, I think, is doubly true in Roadshows. Like, if we play half as good as we would play online, but we win, I don't care. Like, it's about winning on the day. So we had at one point in the LFL, one of the Roadshows, there was an hour and a half pause. Game was kind of even. We were sort of a bit behind. And then straight after the pause, one of our players, Steelback, made an absolutely game-winning call. And we just went for it, did it, got Baron while they were still getting their heads back into the game. And he was like, we're just going to rush Baron straight away.
Amazing.
And I wasn't on the stage. I wasn't allowed to go on the stage this whole hour and a half. It was just a very strange experience. But it was just about that. It was like, look, we just responded to this adversity better and did good enough, to win. So I think that's a good piece of framing to just make sure everyone is aware. Today, this weekend, this week is not about playing perfect in our game. It's about playing better than the people we're up against.
Yeah, definitely. Just to pick up on one of the things you said there, the situations that are unlikely to happen. I found that in reading about it and from my own experience coaching, I find that maybe the hardest one to think about, because you can probably make quite a long list of things that are unlikely to happen that could be detrimental. And I was initially thinking maybe you prepare, you talk, or you linger more on the things that, if they occurred, would be detrimental to your team rather than detrimental to both teams. So, but that way of thinking is maybe flawed, because a pause would affect both teams, and the team that responds better to the pause, like you say, is likely to bounce back. But then I also came across this example of the space station and how, and I forget a lot of the context here, so forgive me, but there was a story about astronauts preparing to go up to the space station. They knew they were going to be up there a long time. It's a form of performance, and they were being prepared for it. And some of the eventualities or the things they were preparing for were, for example, how the individuals would feel if one of them lost a loved one while they were in the space station, and in what kind of support they could give each other in those situations. And the thinking was, it's not something that's going to happen frequently. If it happens, it will be hard. And how can we use what we've got while we're up there to deal with it? And in actuality, it did happen. And this member of the space station at the time had to be consoled by others, and they were prepared for it, and they knew how to work through that. So you could see that would be hugely detrimental if they weren't prepared for it. It was, of course, immensely sad in any case. But that's kind of the example where, how far do you go with the things that aren't likely to happen?
And that's where I bring in my marginal gains thing. So for me, again, it's the idea, the one sentence version of it is nothing is too small to be considered. But in reality, what I'm talking about is a shift and thinking about problems from the other side. So I wouldn't think about a problem. I would maybe make a list of all potential problems could happen, as long a list as I can. And I wouldn't think about them in terms of what's the likelihood of this happening. And if it's a small likelihood, then we'll ignore it. It's how much effort is the fix for this, and if it's worth doing anyway. So again, I think I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but hopefully it explains my idea better, because it actually came up recently in a conversation that I was having with Pitu, who's working with us. He's the guy who makes a data program about the items, Coachless. Really useful, by the way, if anyone's listening to this. Absolutely the best website for using. Yeah, a very shameless plug, because I went and reached out to him rather than the other way around. Like, I was like, can we please use your site somehow? Basically. But anyway, we were speaking about items, and he was talking about making item sets in the game. And not only making item sets, but putting those items on specific slots. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by default. And you can, if you make a set, you can choose where they go. And he was saying, actually, there's something I do, which he was sort of semi-apologizing for, and was saying, like, it's a bit much, but I have my items go on these things, because then when a new item appears, which is a cookie, like it could be useful in a fight, and it appears every 3 minutes. So you don't go and buy it. I put all my other items in a different place so that it will always appear in the same slot. So that without looking, I can always hit 3, and that's always where my cookies are going to be. And for me, that's a perfect example of marginal gains, because is it going to make a difference in a game? Probably not, because mostly if you're in the middle of a fight and one spawns, if you're a challenger player, probably will get the cookie anyway. Also, it's very unlikely to spawn mid-fight and actually be a difference maker in a fight, all those kind of things. And so you could look at that and say, look, the chances of doing this, of this mattering, is like so little.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, you should just flip that entirely around and say, what is the cost of doing this? Which is 2 minutes assigning hotkeys to things, 5 minutes in queue assigning hotkeys to things. And so the cost of it is basically 0. So there's no reason not to do it. So I would approach this list in the same way. I wouldn't think, okay, the chances of there being a power cut is so small and the negative effect is so small. I would think, what would be the fix for this? And is the fix for this worth doing? Like, how much does it cost us to do? And that's what I mean by, like, nothing is too small to be considered. We don't ever throw anything out based on how much negative impact it would have. Mm-hmm. Instead, I'm flipping it around and looking at it from the other way, which is, what is the time cost and the thought process cost to do this? So thought process cost probably for the players will be the biggest one. I'm not going to talk to them about what happens if 100 different scenarios come up, because it's going to be overloading and stressing them out and all those kind of things. But I will look through it for myself. What am I going to do if, once I make the list, maybe I'll share it somewhere on, I can bring it up on a podcast even, or I can share it on Twitter or something like that. I might make a physical list. I'll probably make a digital one.
Yeah.
And just say, like, here's all the things that I want to know before we play our game. How are we going to respond to a pause? What are we going to do after the games? What are we going to do in between games? You know, and the list will go on. And I will look at fixing them based on how much resources, time, energy, thought process it costs, rather than how big an impact it has.
Fantastic. That's funny enough. That is also something that came up in another paper I read about the coach preparing themselves. So we're getting, you know, we focus a lot on the athletes, the performers in that setting. However, all these scenarios, we're talking a lot of them are unlikely. What's not unlikely is you will be displaying some behavior as the coach, and have you factored in how you're going to do your best in those new environments. And so having that written out, just even for your own awareness of, if this happens, I do this and I'm ready to do it, very healthy. And also what works for you when you're in those different environments. So as you say, taking a few days to get used to it is going to be great for you. So when you come to display those coaching behaviors, they're likely to be reasonably excellent, as we expect. So part 2 of step 2. So once you've got all the list of potential things and you discuss them as a team, and you discuss, like, what's going to be detrimental and why, for example, there are obviously the natural extension of that is to discuss possible strategies. But I think we've largely covered that. What was interesting in the way we were talking was that you could almost come up with categories where pauses in game for whatever reason, be it power cut or tech or the software, the responses to that can be A, B, and C, and we prepare for these categories. So I think that's quite an interesting one. So step 3, final step of this 3-step process, would be to then simulate those strategies in training. So prior to actually having to use them, we train them, we prep them, which sounds very, very obvious when you say it, but it's not just knowledge of the strategy is not skill at the strategy. So preparing it in advance and testing it and tweaking it in advance, very, very useful. And that's coming from, you know, the Olympic level. And they describe 2 levels of simulation here. One would be mental rehearsal, so finding time as an athlete to work with whatever multidisciplinary staff or coaching staff you need to think through how you're going to react, and then what might be the optimal reaction, and then training the skills to put yourself in that place. And then modeling, so modeling that scenario and working through it. And that's exactly, you know, that leaves off where we finished last week on pressure training. So you simulate the environment, and then you seek to develop the skills to thrive in that scenario. So that was step 3. An obvious one, there are practicalities there. I'm sure we'll get into like how much time do you spend on every single one, but that's the first step.
And also the thing that we have as a problem in esports is that often we are not in complete control of the practice environment. I was suddenly thinking, oh, what if I just pause my scrims leading up to the week? Or if I pause and I tell them, you're not allowed to speak about the game, we're doing a test pause. I might do it. I might do it anyway, but I would have to talk about it with the opponents first,
right,
and say, do you guys mind if I just drop a pause in randomly and just for a couple of minutes, like we just pause, and I tell my team they're not allowed to talk about the game because we're simulating a pause on stage. I don't know if that will work or not, but I might give that a go as long as they accept it. The problem is that we wouldn't be able to fake an hour-long pause because that's definitely not worth the time, but also that we wouldn't find an opponent who would do
you guys
that.
take lunch, we'll pretend to still be in pause.
We'll pretend to sit around and be in a pause, and no one's allowed to eat or talk. And we'll see. Because that is the rule on stage and in games in general. And I think for most of, if not all of the time of the pauses in the final, people are not allowed to speak. So not only are you paused in the middle of your game, you have to pause and just sit there. Yeah. And you could be sitting there for 2 seconds, and you could be sitting there for 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Normally after sort of 10 minutes, they say you're allowed to talk, but you're still sitting in a 10-minute silence, not knowing. You have to be ready to go right now, but you also have to be ready to wait for another 20 minutes. It's a really, really difficult challenge. So I don't know. We'll have to find a team who scrims us with random pauses. But I might actually ask, because again, I'm hoping they don't watch this show and find out in advance. But I might talk to another team and say, I'm going to put a pause in this first game.
Yeah.
Do you mind?
Would you do it, or would you get the other team to do it?
I would do it, because I would do it at the worst time for us. And I can decide when the worst time for us is. Like, just as we're about to dive, I'm going to pause the game. And then I'm going to say, don't talk about the game. We're doing a test to pause.
Awesome.
What I would want to do is I would want to make sure I've laid as much groundwork as possible before without spoiling it. So I might say, okay, if it's the last day, let's say, I'm going to say, right, we're doing a dry run day. So what we're going to do is we're not going to pretend like this is a scrim about learning. We're going to pretend like this is a competitive game. And if we're going out in between, we're going to go out. Hopefully I've convinced people to let us do it on stage, let's say. And then I might pause and say, we're doing a test pause. No one speak. I like this idea. Because we're streaming our scrims, you'll be able to see it as well.
Yeah.
So I might give it a go.
I think really important. I think it's also something we've seen in practice. For example, if you ever watched G2 during a pause during Ismail's time there, you can see some of the players immediately revert to eyes shut, slow-paced breathing, and just what an incredibly strong routine just to have in place and ready to roll, and you just immediately switch into it. It's just like switching gear. It's not a barrier to performance or anything. If anything, it's a welcome break to collect my thoughts, and just all of that framing around it, I think is something that we win if we prepare those types of routines. So brilliant. I suppose that 3-step process is good, and it's there to sort of think about how do we cope with the adversities that might face us when we go to this roadshow and we start competing. And we've zoomed out quite far as well. I like the fact we've spoken about the build up to the days before and training and all that kind of stuff that we can use to gather information. I think there are other levels, I would say, to the roadshow prep. So it depends, it might be a bridge later on to coaching philosophy, but there is sort of the how are you just presenting this event to the team? So is this a high performance event, or is this an experience? It's something to enjoy and sort of relish as something different from the norm. And what I came across when I was sort of looking into that area of research is the idea of a whole person approach. So we have the performer, we go into a roadshow, we want to prepare as best as possible as an individual, and as a team, and as a coach to perform in those game environments. And there's a string of routines and things that we prepare around that. But it's also maybe a little bit of framing the mindset. So it's yes, it's performance, but it's also we through our participation in this team, we get to go and have this different experience. We get to go and enjoy this new place, be around people that we hopefully at least get on with and value sort of their perspective and their experience as well. And we get to go and do that together in this new place, this new experience, and we get to see maybe the flashy new studio, wonderful new town, and that connecting that to not just a performer is quite useful. And then thinking that way of thinking will also maybe help you uncover potential adversities that you haven't thought about. So, for example, being physically removed from your home location means maybe there's something going on at home that they can't then deal with during that time, and maybe it's on their mind, and it's something that maybe just thinking that them as a whole person, you might start to think, well, if something continues to be problematic at home, it's likely to be magnified when we're away from home and they can't deal with it. So how am I preparing for that? Do I have the tools, the relationship to be able to have those conversations when we're away? So yeah, I think it's interesting to think about it. Just esports is great because we have the opportunity through esports to go to these events and participate in person and take something that started often in a bedroom at a desk setup into this wonderful studio performance environment. But also we are people, and we are being removed from an environment we're comfortable with, and all the opportunities and positives, but also hiccups that presents. So I like that way of thinking.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. There's a few strategies that I'll just kind of throw out that I want to get your opinion on as well. There's a bit more specifics, I guess. Well, one of them is in rugby. I think it's become more standard. I don't know if it just happens to be that England did it and South Africa did it, and those are the ones that I've sort of read about doing it. For the World Cup, the last week, bringing out the families of players and stuff like that. Now, maybe it's not quite the same with esports players. Nowadays, maybe it is. I'm not sure. I always say it was very interesting that of the 6 players on Nord in the first split, 3 of us were married, which is probably the first time that I've seen that in an esports team, at least personally. So it will happen more and more. But even if it's not significant other, it could be parents, or it could even be like brothers and sisters, or that kind of thing. Now, of course, each one of those is very different. And even though I think it's still a good idea, I still sympathize with the complaint of like, well, it's going to distract people. And if you bring someone's girlfriend out, they're not going to be focused. That was the complaint in rugby, but everyone who's done it has said it was the best thing we did, and they've kept doing it. So I don't know a team that started doing it and stopped doing it. There might be one. So firstly, let's just stick with that. So in esports, what do you think about that? If we go to not a roadshow for a weekend in Madrid, but if we go to the World Championship in America or in Korea or whatever it might be, and we get through the group stage or whatever, and we have a week to prepare for the next game, what do you think about bringing out family members and stuff like that?
So first of all, just to deflect a little bit, one other example of it, in the NBA, the Boston Celtics, who won the title last year, they've been doing Bring Your Kids to Work Day. So I think they're actually on game days, they'll be in and around the locker room, and all the madness that might you expect that might bring to a professional environment apparently has been wonderful, and people have been really responding to it, and the coach speaks very openly about that being the best thing that he's done during his time there. So there is clearly a positive precedent there that if professional athletes in these mega sports can combine those two settings of those two spheres of their life, that there's got to be something to it. I think for me it comes down to that conversation with your athletes, because I think some people, and this is very natural, this isn't an issue, I don't think, but some people are just quite different in different social settings. So this is why I push back a bit against using sort of personality tests to define who you're working with and how to work with them, because it kind of depends on what social setting you're referring to. So who are you as a player in your professional team? That person could be quite different to who are you when you're with your parents, for example. And is that going to cause a clash if you then introduce parents into your professional world? So if they're in the studio and they want to have a hug and a kiss and a photo just as you're leaving the stage, how is that going to influence you and your identity?
Yeah.
So
I hadn't thought about that even during practice. I was only thinking about it as a in downtime kind of thing.
Okay.
If they're
Yeah.
there for the week, they're not coming to the hotel where we're scrimming if we're in Korea or whatever. But in the evenings, rather than you hang out with your team that you've been hanging out with very intensely for the last couple of months, you instead go and soul with your parents rather than with the players that you've been there for 2 months already with and see every day and all that kind of thing. And it's a bit of space and downtime. I wasn't actually imagining them coming to practice or that kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes it better or worse.
Well, who knows? I don't think there's an answer. I think it's all down to those relationships, and you as a coach you are probably making those decisions. It's, I would obviously take real care to make sure it's the right decision for everyone. But I think this isn't controversial to say. Like, what a wonderful thing to be able to do, to share those experiences of you in a good place in your career, presumably, like you're competing for something that is meaningful to you, to be able to share that and connect that with other spheres of your life and other people that matter to you. You can imagine that in theory, there's an awful lot of good there. And if you are maybe having some anxious thoughts, being around people that probably have your best interests at heart might go away to alleviating some of those anxious thoughts. So you could see a world of positives there. But it could also be very unusual because it's just something very new. So again, this might be a strategy, it could be a solution, but it should be trained and tested and set up in advance. So
okay.
Sorry, parents, we're going to treat you just as coldly as we are everything else, just as pragmatically as everything else.
Yeah, we're going to test you.
One way of doing it, though, I might have skipped over it, is I saw this in a TED Talk of all places, but the use of role play. So one way that you can just work through some of these hiccups that you might be encountering on the roadshow and figure out whether your strategies are working is by sort of going through a mock scenario where you pretend those things are happening. And it could be awkward, it could be a bit stiff, it could be a bit like a bit of a giggle. But actually, if you get used to sort of role playing these issues, like maybe you role play one player completely ruining the game, running it down, and then you role play how we're going to react and how we're going to boost that person, how we're going to support them, what we're going to say. Just seeing what lands, what resonates, what doesn't, and having done that in advance can be, I think, hugely beneficial. So it might be a little bit cheesy, but I think it's low cost, as you say. It doesn't take too much time to implement and test out and to make a few notes on what worked and what didn't. And then it's probably that little bit more comfortable when it actually comes time to doing it. So I think role playing is a good way of testing these strategies.
Okay. One final question, practical question on this topic before we jump on to the next one, because we're already gone halfway and we have a danger of going on and on as always. I've seen Isma talk about, not exactly what he called it, but sort of staggering sleep to gradually try and cope with jet lag. Is this actually, like, how does this work? Is this something that you would kind of recommend? Because again, the reason I'm asking it specifically is at the moment, the main thing I'm thinking about is Hikaru is flying from Florida to Riyadh for EWC. So the current plan is just fly him out a lot of days early. I still feel like that's better than trying to stagger it and flying him out later. But is this idea of like, well, I gradually go to bed later and later and later, so my body gets used to that time until the day before I go to bed at 2 a.m. because actually that is the time that I would go to bed in the new country, or at least closer. How would you go about doing that, and how much kind of efficacy is that? If I don't know if there's a short answer, but like a succinct way of thinking about it.
I think it's pretty valuable. In all honesty, I'm not the most specialized in sleep, but I have done some research in that area, and circadian rhythm is a big thing. It's a serious thing. Like, you will have your own rhythm will dictate at what point in the day you are physically strongest. So like your circadian rhythm will dictate like when your muscles are at their best, and that's maybe a great time to do physical exercise if you want to move a lot of weight, for example. So circadian rhythm is a serious thing, and you can adjust it over time. So if you know that you're going to be competing in a completely different time zone, at the very least, maybe moving your training to the times you're likely going to be competing could be a good idea. So for example, if you always scrim at night, but the equivalent time will be early morning in the new location, you might want to think about adjusting
That's
that to
what we're
align.
doing. Yeah.
Great.
It's not not a new location with same time, but our game coming up on Thursday could go into like 10, 11 o'clock at night.
Mm-hmm.
And our games on the final will be starting at 11 o'clock in the morning. So even that, it's not even about the time zone difference, but it's just the schedule difference.
I think it's important. I would think about it. I would get close to it if you can. When it comes to the jet lag, I think I won't pretend to be a leading expert in the field, but I think it's not a bad idea. It's tough to do though. It does take a significant amount of time and discipline, and it might not be in the short term, might not be all that pleasant either. So adjusting your sleep by a few hours either way is going to be uncomfortable. So as long as there's time to do that, it might be worth a try.
Okay, great. Yeah, well, I'll explore that for August, although it might be a little bit difficult to do it this time, but for at least next time as well. Like trying to get people to gradually adjust, I think is probably quite a good idea. So that's it for the how to approach roadshows. I'm sure there's more that we can go into. And if you do have any thoughts on these topics, we're going to do a Q&A again at the end. So if you have any opinions or more questions about how you should approach roadshows, anything you think we didn't cover, please do write them in either chat, either YouTube or Twitch. We'll see them and get to them. But that's it for how to approach roadshows. The next topic we want to talk about this week is how to find your coaching philosophy. Now, this one I think is a really fun one because you are in esports starting to be asked about it more and more, at least from my own opinion. When I was looking for jobs 3 or 4 years ago, I don't know if anyone would have used this terminology or even really knew what it was. But this time, of sort of 4 or 5 different places, I would say maybe half are asking you directly, what's your coaching philosophy? And a lot are kind of trying to consider it. Now, we won't go into whether the orgs know what to do with that information that you give them. We'll just focus on how do you find your coaching philosophy? So where would you start? If I'm saying, okay, well, I've been a coach, let's say I'm either not a coach at all, or is it easier to just take one specific person and just say, okay, let's say I've been coaching for a couple of years. How do I find my coaching philosophy? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
How do I get a good answer to this question?
You're asking the right things. Yeah. Ask ChatGPT. Well, danger. Like be red flags. Like be aware that coaching philosophy is an idea that has received quite a lot of flack in the higher levels of coaching science. So there have been like incredible researchers that have been quite outspoken about how coaching philosophy has been this sort of buzz phrase that's thrown around quite a lot. It has been historically quite hard to get agreement on what people mean by it, and certainly its use in practice has been criticized quite heavily for being something that we sort of say that we have, and it doesn't actually influence our coaching at all. And it's become, for some researchers, it's become a bit of a just a sort of I don't know what the right appropriate term is. So you say you have one, okay, check that box, and then we move on and actually we get into the day-to-day of coaching. So I think kind of aligns with your experience. And so the problem is that a lot of coaching philosophies, when you read them, and they're rarely written down, but when you do get the chance to read them, they're often very rigid statements, quite black and white statements about I am this, this, and this. And that coach will then go out in practice and be faced with all manner of situations and scenarios that will challenge that philosophy. And does that philosophy really guide that person in that moment, or are they sort of those philosophy, that philosophy, that rigid statement of sort of quite general behaviors, quite vague behaviors, put to the side, and then decisions are made? Or is it something that actually guides your thinking and is flexible and can accommodate your behavior and how you're going to react and predict how you might react in those scenarios? So it has received quite a lot of criticism. I think the checkbox approach to, as you've experienced, is common, and I think we can do better in the coaching philosophy world and what it means and how to go about building one. So a couple of caveats. Coaching philosophy is more a flexible guide of ideas and statements that will inform your action. it will be based on personal principles. A lot of it will be informed by your prior experience as a coach. So you are likely to inform your coaching philosophy based on your backstory, and that will involve how you were coached yourself, what coaches you've sort of worked alongside, and being conscious of that is really important, because it might not necessarily reflect you unless you're very careful, and it might just be something that you think is what's done or what's said when you're asked about coaching philosophy. So be very careful to think about what really matters to you when it comes to coaching. Why you should have one is, as we've said, you've brought up a few times on the podcast, we don't necessarily always want to be reactive. We want to be proactive. We want to have a direction, so that when we enter into tough times, we have an intuitive feel for where we're going, and that's going to guide our behavior in the moment. And that means that athletes, our players, our performers, have an inkling, have an idea in advance of how we're going to react in those scenarios. And it's not always going to be guesswork and a spontaneous, unexpected decision. And indeed, if we can expect the behavior of the coach, I think you can probably make the claim that it's likely to have a bit more, there's going to be a stronger relationship with that individual, because they're a bit more predictable and they're a bit more, you can sort of rely on their behavior and work with that. So it's generally a good thing to have, a good North Star. It's not going to be exactly what you do in every situation, but it's definitely going to be guiding your behavior, and that's going to be visible to other people. Is that appropriate background?
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. I think you're right. I think having it as a way to be a bit more consistent internally as well, I think is really, really good. It's like this idea from thinking fast and slow. There's like system 2 and system 1 kind of thinking, and making sure that if you don't put the effort in, your system 2 is going to be very lazy, and you're going to kind of say like, well, I'm like this, and like you're not going to actually think it through. And it is worth sitting down in front of an empty page or an empty screen and actually genuinely thinking all this kind of stuff through.
Yeah.
But also the other thing I would say is write it down. That doesn't mean you committed to it. Writing it down the first time is really, really good and really, really hard. And the second time, it will be way more accurate to how you actually are, and it'll be easier. And the third time, it'll be more, you can keep changing this and adapting it. So, I mean, I make what is my coaching philosophy basically every year. So if I look on my Google Drive, I in preparation for this, I wanted to look through what I wrote the most recent time. And so I looked at it on my Google Drive, and I saw, I think there's 2020, 2021, 2022. Like, it's just always going to update and change. And every time there's some things that are they're the same, and there's some things that are changed. And there's actually one thing that kind of changed back in terms of what it was, which is interesting. It changed back a bit from me, but it also changed back because of what everyone else was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking, again, it was actually this marginal gains idea. I was talking about marginal gains, and then there was a period where everyone was talking about it. And so I kind of dropped it a little bit because I was meaning a different thing. And I was thinking there must be a better way to explain this. And then next year, it's going to be different as well. It's going to be inspired by a lot of our conversations, of course, all the stuff around like coach talk and that kind of thing. I don't know if it's helpful. I did write the notes of what I put last time. I can just take you through it, how I laid it out.
Yeah, let's do that. Map it onto the building blocks I have, because I'm sure you'll touch on the same things. So
okay, yeah. So give me your building blocks again, because I had my own building blocks that I might have to add a little one first, but then other than that, I think it does line up.
So in 3 building blocks. Firstly, purpose. Why do you coach? I'm sure you have it. Core values. What principles will you adhere to and uphold in practice? Finally, knowledge of your esport and players. So do the aforementioned purpose and core values, are they practicable? Can you actually uphold them in the context, in the team in which you are coaching? So the obvious one there is, if you believe that, for example, gaming is for everyone, and you want everyone to get to experience it and participate and have a say, then you might have an extremely democratic team environment. But if your emphasis is on winning and high performance, you might empower the best player to make the decisions. Perhaps like there could be a distinction there. So, but it depends a bit on where you're operating.
Okay, yeah, that's some good building blocks. Mine are a bit different. So what I could do is I'll go through what I have with those ideas in mind, and we can right now build it into the other way of doing it. Because actually, to be honest, the biggest thing that's changed over the years is how I've laid this out. So one of the things that I did before, which I quite like, is I found the quotes that I resonated with the most and then sort of built my philosophy based on those quotes, which can be an interesting way to go. But this most recent time, which is currently the one I'm most happy with, I laid it out a little bit differently, which is that I started with defining what coaching is. So it's not quite why I coach, although I do have an answer for that, which I'll get into. But I'd said, what is coaching? Also gave me a chance to talk about the Coach Talk podcast, so I could drop that in. Because I think how you see the role will obviously dictate how you do it, what you think is part of your job as coaching. I included the people who inspired me the most, who've had the biggest impact on my own practice. Then I had a sort of section that I called the section coaching philosophy, which I'm now thinking is very confusing, but it was sort of what's the most important thing for me as a coach? What do I see as the most important things? And then the last bit is what did that actually mean to me? So I had sort of almost 3 buzzwords almost, and then what does the extra one mean to me? And that was a bit of an extra breakdown. So firstly, why I coach, I would say 2 things. Firstly, I'm incredibly competitive. I hide it well sometimes, but I'm incredibly competitive. So when I've worked with coaches, for example, or when I've done work in video, the reason that I found those kind of less sustainable, although the working with coaches is a separate thing. The reason I found video a little bit less sustainable is being at an event and not having an impact on the result is very, very difficult for me. So I love a lot of the stuff around it, but it's actually just really difficult to watch a team lose and think, I could have helped that. I could have had an impact on that. So that's what I mean by I'm very, very competitive. And the second one is that I want to have a positive impact on the people around me. Coaching for me is the best way to do that. I like to do that, not in my coaching. I was going to say, like, even if the people around me don't necessarily want that impact. But anyway, that's the main thing for me. So firstly, like I said, what is coaching? I think for me is a very interesting one to start with. So for me, coaching is part teaching, which is when you know something and the person you're working with doesn't know it. How am I going to instill that knowledge? Part what I've called mentoring, in which I mean the leadership and just the direction point of view and the kind of out of game stuff. It's really important to be a mentor to the people that you're working with, not just in League of Legends, but in life in general. And then the last part, which I think is really crucial, is it's partly exploration. That's when no one knows what we're trying to find the answer to. And I think that's really, really important as well, especially when you want to be the best in the world at something. That definitionally means you're going to be learning things that no one knows the answers to. So how does this exact situation work? Or can we get this and this as a cross-map trade? Like maybe we don't know. And so for me, it's really important to have thought that through so that I can come into each of those situations thinking, here are the tools, here's the kind of tools that I'm thinking about when I'm teaching someone something. And I feel like I know the answer. And how do I get the other person to the level of knowing the answer, which will be a part of it? Then it's what are the things that are important to me around the mentoring stuff, which a lot is about, I really believe in leading by example and stuff like that. So making sure I'm paying real attention to my own behavior as well as the other stuff, but also making sure I'm giving people a space to talk about issues same we talked about last week, talk about non-League of Legends stuff or non-whatever you're competing in stuff. And then the last one is the exploring and how you approach that. And for me, I guess I would say the way that I approach it is very open. I don't ever want to pretend like I know the answer. because if I pretend I always know the answer, then as a coach, then it immediately cuts out any possible exploration, because I'm not going to be comfortable going into an environment where I don't know if the only reason that I think I'm valuable as a coach is because I have the answer to their questions, the players' questions. So that I think is a really crucial one for me. And then the last thing on this, on what is coaching, for me is a quote from Steve Hansen, which I love, which is, he said, "Your job as a coach is to make it as simple as possible." I think if you have a one sentence answer for what is coaching, rather than my long rant from just now, that's the best way to approach it for me by miles. So, of course, as possible, sometimes there's a lot of heavy lifting. It can still be quite complicated and be as simple as possible. But that being a goal for me, like I don't want people to hear what I'm thinking and think, "Oh my goodness, that's so complicated." I want the opposite.
Mhm.
I want them to hear what I'm thinking and say, "Oh, I actually understand that." That's the whole point. And I think that's a really big difference between people who are, if you take the game as specific, people who are analysts, especially analysts on the broadcast, and people who are coaches. Because actually it's beneficial to you, especially if you're a co-streamer, for example. It's beneficial if you can explain stuff in a way where it sounds really complicated and it sounds like you're the only one with the answer. And so people should watch you because you can explain things about the game that are just so, you're just so smart and you're so above everyone else. You know, that's a useful thing if you're analyzing the game. But as a coach, you should be striving for the opposite. I want people to think, "Oh, I'd never thought about it like that. That's so simple. Like I never got it until now."
Mhm.
And that's perfect. So everything that I'm doing as a coach is always to try and make it as simple as possible. That's
Fantastic.
my what is coaching. First building block.
That's the first building block,
Yeah.
because that's I think already pretty advanced, I would say. My thoughts on that were there were probably a lot of values in there. A lot of you value competition, you value exploration in terms of game specific, but also person. So
Yeah.
giving them space
Yeah.
to talk, you explore with them their world. That's, I think, a value you might have, giving them that space. You value having an impact beyond just game strategy. You want to have a positive impact. So that probably means like, relational as well. And the mentorship, probably, being someone that people can confide in and trust. That's probably something that is indicative of a value. I'd actually push back on to make it as simple as possible, because I think that whilst I understand and I like it, I think you would probably say people are complex and that you wouldn't always take that route with someone. I think you would probably be, there will be times where a situation is very complex and you'd probably allow it to be complex and explore different avenues.
Definitely that's true. Definitely that's true. What I mean is that the stuff that I'm working on with players, I want the reaction from them. Like I want the thing that we're trying to gain or the thing that we're trying to learn, I want to make it as simple as possible for us to. So I guess maybe if you take a more straight definition of coaching as like, actually, maybe it was you even who said this on the podcast, helping people achieve their goal. It's like, I want to make it as simple as possible for people to achieve their goal.
So
That
with clarity,
would be my way of, yeah. I think
like
clarity and you're right, simplicity. It's still exactly what I mean in certain contexts.
right.
But I'm a coach more than anyone not more than anyone, more than a lot of people in esports who, when someone says, "What do you do about this?" I'm like, "Well, it depends."
Okay, there you go.
And that's been a problem in interviews before, because I'm like, well, it depends. Like it doesn't. I would never approach something in the same way. So, so you're right there as well.
But I think your values are very strong there, and just by stringing that together, I think you've got a good handle on the philosophy already. Okay, please continue.
Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, now you're saying it like that, I've realized that what I've kind of done with my building blocks, not intentionally, because I'm only just realizing it. I wrote this down, whatever it was, 6 months ago, and I'm only realizing now, is that I've kind of gone wide and I guess most philosophical, then next stage and a bit more practical, and then next stage and most practical.
Great.
So I've kind of, each one of my building blocks gradually gets you to what I actually might do on a day.
Great.
Which was unintentional, but now makes sense.
Leading the field, as always.
Yeah. So the next block I have is kind of like, what is your most important thing? So for me, I had three that I want to talk about, which again, now I'm realizing come from what I was talking about just then with the what is coaching. The first one is that I believe in the power and importance of purpose. And I believe in connecting with the people around me and the players to genuinely try and find out their purpose and like why we're here. I believe in making it more than just to win the NLC in League of Legends. I absolutely love the example of someone like Lars Robel, where the work that he does, it doesn't start with like, what's the goal, what we're trying to achieve? It's what's the dream.
I love that.
And his way of explaining what's the difference is like, okay, but why? So he was talking about working with an Olympic athlete. He was saying like, okay, I want to win a gold medal. And it's like, well, why? And you think that'd be an easy thing to answer, but it's really not. And you get really deep into it. And he said in this specific example, it was like, well, I want my dad to be proud of me. And that for me is, I mean, it literally gives me goosebumps even repeating someone else's story, let alone thinking about if you've ever had that kind of moment yourself with players. So that for me is an absolutely fantastic one. There's a great speech, I think, before the World Cup final that they put fully online that you can find on YouTube, whereas he's talking about they don't know what we know. And they had this thing in the team where they really connected with each other and really connected with each other's purpose for being there. And were making, at one point they had, for example, family members on the numbers on the back of the shirt. I think it's a fantastic thing.
Amazing.
And all that kind of stuff. And actually, Sia Khaleesi, the captain, when he was asked on a podcast, what did you think in half time, when you're 1 point up against England, who were the favourites at the time? And he said, I wasn't worried at all because I looked around the locker room and I knew why everyone was there. And I knew they knew why I was there. And we talked about, they basically relied on all these unbelievable stories, people coming from absolutely horrible, horrible backgrounds. I mean, even Sia Khaleesi, for example, his thing was like, I can't remember exactly how he said it, but it was something like, someone was asking him how hard his early life was. And he was saying, well, yeah, I might have had to walk 8 miles a day to get water. I was in so much better situation than loads of people around me because like I had occasional food or something like that. So it's like these kind of things. And just that has to come from a real connection with the players. And so that's the first thing that I have as my most important thing. The next one, which does, again, kind of feed from that and from all the stuff I've mentioned before, is that I believe in putting a lot of kind of primacy, or however you'd say it, on the culture, doing a lot of proactive work around the culture of the team. Now, I let the culture come from everybody, and that's part of the point. We all have a big impact on it. I think that goes not just with the team, but with everyone who's there. If, for example, we have a media person who's there all the time, I want them to be an equal part of the culture conversation because they're an equal part of the culture of the team because they're there all the time. And for me, as if I had to have one thing from the culture, it's that to build an environment where we're accepting of mistakes. I have never experienced in esports. I've got closer and closer, maybe not always closer and closer, but over the years, hopefully, which ties into the exploring thing.
Yeah,
because you can't explore if you're afraid of being wrong in front of your team, and most times we are afraid of being wrong. I think that's a real problem we have in the team at the moment.
Yeah.
As an example, which I've spoken about a little bit before. So yeah, that's that. And then the last one is that I'm very process driven as a coach and very process focused. So I want to know why we're doing what we're doing and how we're going to judge its success and how we're going to approach everything. I don't want to be winging stuff. I want to be knowing, okay, this is how we do scouting. This is what's going to happen. Who's going to check it when, all that kind of thing. And then when that happens, we can then look back on it. So that's kind of my second thing. And then the last section
that's
is just
also your clarity, by the way. That last behavior, what you look for, that links to your clarity value. So as you say, getting more practical there. I love how these are building on the previous step. It's great.
Good. And then the last thing is just to take apart the process thing a bit more, because I do now again drop in this term marginal gains. And actually, even now, I would define it a little bit differently. I would define it like I did earlier in the podcast, where it's about shifting your perspective and looking at problems from the other point of view. looking at a problem saying, how much resources is it going to cost us, not how much gain does it give us, because any gain I want to look for. But the way I defined it in the 2025 philosophy of me was that nothing is too small to be considered, like I mentioned before. Then the next step is to make everything conscious, which is a phrase that I've stolen from Romain, who's the G2 general manager, which I love. It just a great way of describing the same thing that it's like spent ages trying to explain it in like long terms, and he's just like 3 words covers it all.
Bingo.
Is that whatever you're doing, let's make it conscious. Let's know what we're doing, and we can talk about why we're doing it. And then if it works, great, we can repeat it much easier because we know what we did and why we did it. And if it doesn't work, we can examine it and say, why didn't it work? And do we still agree with the methodology or all those kind of things? So nothing is too small to be considered. Make everything conscious, and then attempt to leave no stone unturned. So that's my definition of how I think about marginal gains, and that's what I want to be doing in the day-to-day. So whenever we approach scrims, it's like, okay, we have a pre-scrim meeting. We're not just going to come together and chat. We're going to have a strict process of what we go through, and then we're going to gradually adapt that process for this team of saying, okay, with this team, we need to talk more about draft and less about this. Or the biggest one for me is now it's on stream. How does it change? And that's been the biggest challenge for me over the last, whatever it is, 4 or 5 months now, or 5 months that I've been working with Nord. So that's the kind of, now I'm seeing it starting widest and furthest away from actual day-to-day, and hopefully building towards what I might actually do on a day-to-day that's me, the stuff that I do, like I go to scrims and stuff like that. I don't feel the need to put that in a coaching philosophy, but the stuff that I might do on a day-to-day that might be different. So that's kind of what I've included as we've gone down.
Yeah, I love it. It was wonderful to see the waterfall, the cascade of this feeds into this, feeds into this. It's fantastic. And I think what's a real strength here, and this is why a coaching philosophy is not just 3 verbs that you say that you are. It's a whole page of action statements and reasons for that, and whether that's appropriate for your context. And in your case, it's appropriate to be explorative because you're working at a level where you have knowledge and can appreciate different outcomes, and players have knowledge to generate ideas, and you can learn from errors, and it's not going to be a setback. So I think that's appropriate. You have knowledge of your context that all applies and fits, and it's flexible. So what you said there are all behaviors based on values which will roughly apply in all the different contexts you might anticipate as a coach, with a few caveats, but you have enough there. For example, exploration might not be the approach that you take in a situation where 2 players have had a heated conflict and one person was clearly in the wrong. However, your values there of having a positive impact, being a mentor, we can almost predict how you might be towards that individual. So I love how that links together and it is flexible. The one I can possibly get at, but I wonder if you could articulate, was the purpose once again. So is it your purpose for coaching? Is that to have more experiences in the competitive environment because that is something you enjoy, to have more experiences in the positive impact of others because that's something you get a great deal of satisfaction from, or are there other purposes sort of at the very beginning of all this?
Good question. I think in a sense it's all of the above,
right?
In a way, I would say the one that it's the most with, this is where it's starting to become a bit more practical, I guess. So what I'm sort of saying here is not that it's my purpose to connect with others, is that I put a lot of emphasis on trying to find purpose of the people around me, because that is what allows me to have the most positive impact on them in the past. But I would say now especially that those moments are almost the most important thing to me. But I wouldn't have said that a few years ago because also I'd had less of them. And
Right.
knowing that they are going to be that important to me does allow them to be, much more impactful. I mean, there's times we spoke a little bit about some of the stuff we did in the boot camp. I think those interviews, for example, that we did in the boot camp will probably be my best memory of that winter split. Not winning the semi-final, or even if we'd have won the final, probably not winning the final, to be quite honest. That's just the thing for me. But that's not really what I was talking about at that moment. I think actually I can speak to, I phrased this I recorded a video for this so that I could send it to organizations and stuff like that. So I think how I arrived at saying it in that way was, what I really wanted to say is I put a lot of emphasis on connecting with players. And I was doing this with my wife. I think it's always very important to do this with someone. It's not very important. It makes it a million times easier to do it with someone. So we just ask you, okay, but why? Or all those kind of things. And it was sort of, okay, why? Why do you connect with the players? Why do you think that you're going to spend more time connecting with players than other coaches? And that's where this purpose thing kind of came from. And so that ended up going first instead of second, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it started with I know that I'm going to spend more time trying to connect with the players, and then working out, okay, but why do I think that's important? And I thought one of the reasons it's important to me is because I made that mistake over and over again when I was coming up in my coaching. That was the thing that, looking back now, I should have spent 100% more time on. Well, not 100%, more than 100% more. I should have spent so much more emphasis on that and really connecting with the people that you're working with, even if it's online or whatever.
Yeah, beautiful. I love hearing that, and thank you for sharing those words. From my side, I think the only thing left to say on this would be that it is okay for anyone listening to have a different philosophy. So there isn't one for every coach, and it is quite okay to, and maybe we often find this perhaps earlier in our coaching career, it is quite okay to say that at this stage I don't have perhaps the most refined set of core values around why I'm doing this. I like to win, and I want to prove to others my worth, my value by winning, and I want to show other people that I am a competent human being and a good coach, and I do that by chasing competition and chasing winning, and I have certain behaviors that align with that. So I have high standards for my team, and I seek the best players. That's okay, and obviously, if it's done with an ethos of appropriate care and management behind it, I think that's okay, and that might be the purpose for some other person. It could well be that somebody is inherently involved in coaching because they want those connections with other people, and they find themselves being offered positions higher up the chain where they might not get those connections. So at the highest level of performance, like sometimes it's quite a cutthroat world, and you might be finding yourself getting offers at a level where it might conflict with the values and your purpose for coaching, and you might have to think, hang on a second, maybe it doesn't quite fit, maybe it's not for me. And so essentially there are differences, there are different types of coaching philosophies you can have. They will likely change over time. One of the key things that all literature agrees on, which is what you do and which is enormously impressive, is to write it down and revisit it, because it will change as you change and as you learn and develop. And one of the keys to all of this is developing self-awareness. So I'm spending time thinking about why you got into it, why do you do it, what do you want out of it? And then over time you can reflect on, are those things actually true? So I think earlier in my life, I wrote down a coaching philosophy that was something about, I want to have lasting connections with those that I work with. And then I realized, like maybe 2 or 3 teams that I started coaching way back when, I don't have much connection with those individuals anymore. Geographical reasons and this, that, and the other. It wasn't a breakdown in the relationship. It was just time and being far removed. So then I thought to myself, well, hang on, it doesn't degrade my coaching experience. So what was it that I took from it and makes me want to carry on doing it? So that changes to perhaps wanting to do the best for those people I'm around and leave them in a better position through our experience together. But also my purpose was maybe to learn more about myself as a human being and to appreciate the full range of human emotions that we can possibly have, and maybe learn to carry myself in a certain way that can go on into the future. Maybe that's more true to my coaching philosophy and purpose for coaching. So there is a whole myriad of different constellations here, and developing that self-awareness just to identify those values that you have, why you might be engaging in the activity, and what behaviors they lead to, and that they're flexible enough to be actually robust in practice and not just be knocked out of the park or left to the side of the road when times get tough, for example. So
I think that's really good. Yeah. I think it's really, really useful. We'll move on to a Q&A now. But do you want to, in conclusion, you want to lay out those building blocks again? Because I think that's a great structure. So what I would say is have a go with these building blocks. There's no wrong answer. I think doing it and realizing in a year, I did that terribly, is part of the process. That's great.
Yes.
Find someone to do it with you if you can, and ask questions about it. Okay, why that? Why that? What are the building blocks? What's the
so my building blocks, which I do think map onto yours, but I think you actually articulated yours with these questions, which was really nice. So my purpose, so why are you coaching? And this actually a really nice question to ask yourself is what is coaching to you? So that stems from your one. What's the most important thing was your question. Mine would be very similar. Like, what are your core values? So what matters to you in coaching? Like, what are the standards? What are the principles you're going to abide by? And the acid test is, are they consistent across all the scenarios you can imagine facing as a coach? Do your knowledge and experiences, are they compatible with your philosophy? So if your philosophy is geared towards super high level, super high performance, but you're working at grassroots, there's some tension there that needs to be recognized, and maybe you need to pursue a new path to really live your coaching philosophy. So it's purpose, values linked to behavior. So that's a flexible action statement, and then recognition of your knowledge and experiences, and do they all align? So
I think it's really good. I think as well, I don't know if I even mentioned this, it's good to have these like coaches who've inspired you the most as well. So the two that I always say is Raz Erasmus and Sir Dave Brailsford. And also be aware of what people hear when you say those things. I think that's a useful one, because of course talking is just about communication. So your opinion of those coaches is one thing, but you do need to be aware of what that means. So I have to be aware that, especially if I talk to someone who's English, as soon as I say Razzie, I know that I'm also communicating to them that I don't mind being annoying for the other team and being known as a bit of a someone who'll just do any little thing to get ahead. I have to be, if I'm going to say that name, I have to be comfortable with that. So, if you're going to say Phil Jackson, you probably also should make sure that you should be aware of the like Buddhism part of it and the like philosophy part of it as well. Even if you don't necessarily subscribe to it, you just have to know what you're communicating by saying those people. But it is a good shorthand if you can have a couple, and either a couple of very different ones, or like me, a couple of very similar ones, which I think they're basically the same approach. And exactly, be aware of what that means.
Yep.
Great. So we'll move briefly on to Q&A. I saw a few questions coming from the chat, some kind of more simple ones that hopefully we can just get a direct answer to. But if you do have more questions on how do you find your coaching philosophy, or how should you approach roadshows, please put them in the chat. First one that I saw already, which hopefully you can just tell me, from Rizzy Beres. Sorry if I butcher anyone's names. If anyone's given me their names already, hopefully I'll use your actual name. But Matt mentioned a TED Talk about role playing. What is the name of the TED Talk? Do you have that?
Yeah, I have a list. The Science of High Performing Teams, leadership speaker David Burkus.
Okay, so I will put it in the YouTube description, but also if you can drop it in the Twitch chat, if you have the ability to do that, I'm not sure. And we can do that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying a bit of a new setup today. So Nico is producing the show, which is awesome. But if you do have feedback on how it sounds and all that kind of thing, do let us know. As always, it's just going to be gradually. We're going to gradually get better every single time. That's the hope. Jack from YouTube was saying, coaches who don't have written info on their approach with their teams, they have a lot to say if you ask, but it's incredibly rare for them to show you something. he said this is a red flag. I would change it into a question. Is this a big red flag for you if a coach is just thinking things and not writing anything down? And I mean, especially if you can see inconsistencies with how they've approached previous teams. It's strange in a way. If you've written it down, I feel like the inconsistencies aren't that big a deal. If you can say, okay, right, if I say, right, on Solari, I really didn't value the connection with the players anywhere near highly enough. And because of that experience, I would now realize that it's the most valuable thing for me. That works. But if I say it's the most valuable thing and someone looks back and I just was saying something different then somehow it doesn't work as much. But is it a red flag if coaches haven't gone through this kind of process? Or is it just they haven't thought about the fact that they need to? Because they haven't listened to this fantastic podcast.
Maybe a very contested statement, but I would say most of us don't write down an awful lot of things we do very well.
True.
So I think it's more the thing that maybe separates the coaches that are going to go on to have a fantastic career for a long, long time are the ones that are assiduous or regular, routine writers down of their thoughts and information. But there are other ways to do it. And maybe they reflect in different ways, and maybe they have different skills, and they remember things very clearly without those aids, and they're very conscious of what they're doing and why. Maybe they reflect with peers, and the peers are very informed about who they are, and they hold them to account, and they point out those inconsistencies. So, however, I think generally speaking, we would all probably benefit from doing a bit more writing about where we're at and what's going on and why.
And I think as well, one thing you mentioned there with the peers is that would also be a little bit of a, not necessarily a warning sign, and I'll explain that in a second. It could actually be a really good sign in a weird way. Is that if someone doesn't have either something written down or some peers that they talk to a lot, the idea that there's this big thing a little bit in coaching of kind of doing everything yourself, and like being the supreme macho, no matter your gender, figure that has all the answers and that kind of thing. And that could be a bit of a warning sign for sure. The only reason I say it might not be a warning sign is if, let's say, it's a coach that I was going to work with as a supporting them, then it's like, well, there's a huge potential area for growth right there. We can just talk about the things that you've done and you might get twice as effective overnight. So it's up and down. There's one from Robin. How often do you do the podcast? It's almost always Friday and almost always at 5 CEST. So it's not exactly the same every time. Next week, unfortunately, it won't be at 5, but we actually haven't decided a time for next week, which we have to do soon. So unfortunately, I don't have a very good answer. It is always on YouTube. It is always, I mean, it's on Twitch too, but the VOD on YouTube stays there forever. It's in the on my channel, there's a podcast section, and you can find all 11 other episodes of the Coach Support Show as well, and hopefully see how we've got a little bit better as we go through. Like we always say, is the main goal. Last one then from Nico to finish us off in a good way. Are we going to go for full body paint in Copenhagen like Roman does for G2 games? Just for mental push. Well, I would say that he's the manager. So I think that's a question you should be asking Kyle, our manager, rather than myself. Because as a coach, I think it's just I have to wear a suit. So also, I think anyone who's doing full body paint now has got to put a lot of work in the gym beforehand, because otherwise the comparisons are going to be very unfavorable. I'm not sure it's good for my ego to have 2 pictures of me and Roman next to each other without our shirts on.
You're a regular gym goer, though. You gym almost every day.
Yeah, but that is true. But it's still there's levels to this. There's levels. maybe in a couple of years.
For now, levels to this. Also, another slogan for the show as well.
Yeah, it depends. This is a bit nerdy, and there's levels to this. Why a suit? It's actually become a thing in esports, but for me, it's just an excuse. I love wearing a suit, so it's an excuse to wear a proper suit, stuff like that.
Useful
okay,
pocket.
Right. We're gonna stop it there. I might, if I was doing, when I'm in the LEC and I'm doing it every week, I can build up a style, a specific style like Klopp or like Pep or someone like that. But for now, just keep it simple. Just do an actual suit. Great. So that's it. Really enjoyed it again, as always. And like I said, that's even just doing that has changed my coaching philosophy again. And when I write it out in 2026, I'll I'll see how much is different just from all these conversations that we have. So definitely just keep evolving it, keep progressing it forward. And I'll keep you updated with how we approach the roadshows in the future. In the next, well, there's one in 4 weeks and then one in a couple of months. So we can even do a follow-up on this. But yeah,
Yes.
thanks everyone for watching. And
Thanks,
we'll see you
everyone.
next time.